onto another big move in the game space overall. This is a follow-up article to an article that released about 2 weeks ago, which articulates that Embracer Group has announced a sale of Gearbox Studios to Take-Two for $460 million. This comes on the back of Embracer selling Saber Interactive Group to the original co-founders for $247 million 2 weeks ago. So big moves on the Embracer side. Let's talk about a little bit of historical context. So historically, Embracer Group has spent billions on a roll-up strategy, buying a significant number of studios, including some of the world's largest IPs, including the Lord of the Rings IP. They were often considered one of the most ascendant games holding companies until, I don't know, I'd say like the mid-2023, when they were reportedly raising another $2 billion from who was said to be the Savvy Games Group, but that deal fell through. And that was sort of like the Titanic shift moment for Embracer Group when they went to being ascendant to really having to scramble to rationalize their business. So why does this matter? In an era of cheap money, roll-ups make sense. You can arbitrage private market value to the public market value, which are almost always higher. The key question here is, in an era of real interest rates, that means, money is not free. Does the consolidation make sense if you're not going to also centralize studios and consolidate costs? And so one of the main things, Embracer Group was one of the preeminent holding companies who talked about the federated states model, I believe is what they called it. And basically the idea is that you have a bunch of decentralized centers of power. Now, they did a little bit in that they basically created a handful of various centers of power and rolled up many studios underneath those, which is a little bit distinct from actually centralizing the full command and control, as you see it sort of like larger game companies, someone like Activision. So all this is to say, it's interesting to see where Embracer Group has landed. We've seen disparate levels of success with this roll strategy. It's very, very, very clear that Embracer Group was a little over-aggressive with their balance sheet, and now we're having to unwind some of what they've done. So I don't know what this means for the company overall. They still have a ton of really, really good assets, a ton of really, really good properties, a lot of really good development shops, but it seems like they're at least rationalizing their business. And anywhere for Gearbox to land, Take-Two, can you ask for a better place for it to land? Top tier publishing company globally, so makes sense. Any thoughts about either Embracer Group specifically or the macro trends that this implies?
Yeah, and I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with Gearbox, but for anyone who's not, they're most known for the Borderlands franchise, which I think has always been traditionally published by Take-Two. Yeah, this is very interesting to see. And, we recently covered the divesting of Saber Interactive, now with Gearbox. For fun, I just have pulled up Embracer's website in the background, and you can see like an empty space. Here, I'll just screen share for a second for fun. So we can see on Embracer's website kind of an empty square where I'm guessing Saber was, and Gearbox, the square is going to be empty pretty soon as well. So we can also kind of see like who's left in the Embracer family. So THQ Nordic, PlayOn, Coffee Stain, Amplifier, Deca, EasyBrain, Asmodee, Dark Horse Media, Freemode, and Crystal Dynamics. So that's what's left of the Embracer Group. Xander, I think you brought up an interesting point, which is like these roll-ups made sense when you could arbitrage the markets. And when you can't, the question becomes a lot more practical of what is the operational efficiency that's gained by these roll-ups. And it's not that they can't be there. I think it's just a question of if teams can execute on it. Because, one thing we find all the time talking to game developers is a lot of them just want to focus on building games. They don't want to build out user acquisition divisions, marketing analytics arms. We're closest to those spaces, but I think there's other functions that are not at the heart of what differentiates a good game developer from a bad game developer. So I think it makes a lot of sense theoretically to have these roll-ups and centralize these services, because you don't need a full giant marketing team and user acquisition workforce if you're only launching one game every 3 years and doing the bulk of that marketing over like a 6-month period, which is like, how a lot of console games are marketed. So it makes sense that you can gain efficiencies if you have a portfolio of companies and centralizing those resources. We're friends with some folks at Embracer Group. I don't want to make any judgments of how well they've executed it, like kind of operationalizing this piece, but we'll just say the federated model in general. I think that's the question, is like, have they been able to operationalize and optimally build out the centralized resources where they make sense without removing the autonomy that these game developers hope to remain by participating in these federated models? And I think the record seems to show that so far the model has not been perfected, let's say, at the least.
Yeah, we're being very diplomatic. I would say that there isn't any use case, and I generally agree with you. I'd say there haven't been screaming examples to the contrary, right? So it seems like, by and large, the federated models tend to have been a zero interest rate phenomenon, and the companies that I follow that have done this seem to be struggling. And so we will see what happens. I think the solution is you diagnosed it, right? And there's a pretty clear solution, which is if you need to divest assets to maintain your balance sheet, fine. Centralize the synergies, for a shitty fucking McKinsey word. Basically, that means like go to market is a place you can obviously centralize. Hit up Upptic if you want some help there. Embrace Group. But also, people talk about customer support. I mean, there's a number of resources that you could use across these studios, which can sort of economies of scale make sense. And I think until we see a shining example of a federated states model that works, I'm going to remain skeptical.
Well, one thing that I've seen kind of across the board is a lot of them are largely focused on centralizing the games to these businesses, but are very light on centralizing like the infrastructure needed to support the games. And I don't know if that's just like a company culture thing, if they bring people from the games BD world and that's what their North Star is just acquiring great gaming companies. But they've historically seemed very disinterested in acquiring. And again, we have a biased perspective here because we are part of that infrastructure. But if you just look at some of the federated gaming companies, they're very light on M&A around the actual infrastructure needed to scale and support games, where there is arguably like more centralized value and redundancies that can be removed by adding that infrastructure. So again, very biased perspective, but I would say that that's maybe another area that can be improved.
Yeah,
in these entities.
Totally agree. And I'm going to just talk our book for a second. I mean, what I see across many of these game companies, and we talk to a lot of game companies, Warren, is that most game companies underinvest in the actually core go-to-market infrastructure, which is distinct from the game infrastructure, right? And so even the most sophisticated companies in the world that we talk to a lot of them. I mean, this is biased. I would argue our tooling is at least on par with it, if not better in many cases. And there's a very, very obvious business reason for that as to why, right? And the reason for that is it's really, really fucking hard to make games. And if you have $1 that you're going to spend on improving some part of your business, it's almost always going to go to the thing that is most important to your business. And so the resources get consolidated around the game development. And even when I talk to really, really sophisticated go-to-market folks, they're always resource strapped. Just leave it at that. They're always resource strapped. And so I think your point is taken. And I think that if you need help with that, hit up Upptic. All right, enough shilling.
No, I was just going to say, and it's not even to say that that's wrong, because at the end of the day, the world's best marketing team can't make a horrible game successful.
Right.
So it makes sense for game companies to focus on, when they do have limited resources, focus on putting every dollar into the game itself. And we see all the time reporting on game success cases like Power World, where there's no real marketing force behind that. It's just great games getting traction. So that all being said, if teams are consolidating, it does make sense to, make consolidated resources around go-to-market features.